it's a very busy time. And hello to those who couldn't make it in person and who are with us on the Teams call. Welcome to tonight's talk with our very own head of department here at St. Andrews, Dr. Simon Prosser. His research focus is primarily on philosophy of mind and perception, but also metaphysics. And Dr. Prosser's major work, Experiencing Time, published with Oxford University Press, is one of the major publications on the topic. Very big name, very big professor. And I know that in your spare time you're also an avid photographer, so you always love little works. Tonight Dr. Prosser will be speaking to us about the role of the body in spatial experience. So without further ado, please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Dr. Simon Prosser.
So I gather it's considered okay for speakers to remove masks for philosophical talks. So I'm going to, might be a bit easier for people online as well. That's an amazingly free feeling. I haven't been able to do that in front of a group of students for a very long time. Okay, so I'm going to talk about some work in progress. I'm writing this up as a standalone article, but it's also the same ideas are likely to end up in a chapter of a book that I'm gradually writing on consciousness. But today I'm going to be just talking about spatial experience and presenting a certain view of spatial experience, which is one of a sort of type of view that I think applies to all kinds of experience. And that's what I'll be defending in the book. But today I'm not going to try to say much about that, just spatial experience today. So, first of all, just some preliminaries, just a very small amount of jargon that I'll be using. Philosophers of mind like to talk about the phenomenal character of conscious experiences. So the phenomenal character is that property of a conscious experience that characterizes what it's like for you to have the experience. So it's the subjective character. So if you imagine looking at a red object and looking at a green object, there's a difference in the subjective visual experience that you have, and the property of your experience, which you shouldn't conflate with the property of the object that might be red or green. The property of your experience that characterizes that sort of subjective character, that's the phenomenal character. People used to talk about qualia a lot, and sometimes still do, and that's a similar notion, but it's got a bit more metaphysical baggage. I'll also be using the word phenomenology a bit, and I'll use it in a very broad sense, meaning anything relating to phenomenal character or experiences with phenomenal character. I hope it'll be fairly evident what I mean when I say that, but do just let me know when it's unclear. And lastly, representational content. Most philosophers of perception, or many philosophers of perception, probably a majority, think that experiences have representational contents. All I mean by saying that an experience has a representational content is that it has an accuracy condition, the way things need to be in order for it to be an accurate or veridical experience. So take your visual experience right now. You're seeing me in front of you and a screen with some text on it and so on. The accuracy condition for that experience is that I am standing here and there's a screen and I'm wearing this colour shirt and so on. If the world is that way, then your experience is accurate. But usually when we talk about the representational content of experience, that's to allow for the possibility of inaccurate or misrepresentational experiences. Maybe things aren't the way they appear to be. That's not going to be critical for anything today. So there's a lot of interest in the relation between the phenomenal character of an experience and its representational content. I'm going to assume that everything in your experience does have some representational content. That is to say, whenever you're having a conscious experience with a given phenomenal character, because it has that phenomenal character, it is representing things as being a certain way. In fact, I might want to make a much stronger claim than that. I might want to say actually that phenomenal character is reducible to representational content, but I'm not going to emphasize that today. So crudely then, the way things seem to you phenomenologically is a reflection of the way the world appears to you to be. Those two things go together. Okay, now, suppose that after you go to bed tonight and you fall asleep, a crazed supervillain takes a shrink ray and shrinks the room that you are in, along with everything in it, including you. So everything is just miniaturized, down to say half the size. When you wake up tomorrow morning, prior to walking out of the building or looking outside, will you notice any difference? I think a lot of us have a strong feeling that you won't. You'll wake up and you'll still look around you and everything will be in the same proportion to everything else, including you, your body. And so it'll all just seem just the same. Those of you who know about physics will know that you can't miniaturize things without changing some certain things, but trust me, there's a way to set this up to avoid any of those problems. When you walk out of your house, having been miniaturized, however, it seems quite plausible that the world will appear to you huge. People walking past in the street will look like giants. The road will appear some enormous wide thing. So, all of this seems to suggest that the way things seem to you with regard to their size and their distance and those spatial properties might not necessarily be about how your experience represents them being in terms of size. Actually, Berkeley had the same idea. This is a quotation from 3 dialogues between Hylas and Philonous. I won't bother to read it out, but Berkeley had the idea that to a mite, as he puts it, a small insect, some very small creature, an object that to you would seem like just a medium-sized object not very far away, to the mite would appear like a huge mountain a long, long way away. So even as long ago as Berkeley, a lot of people have had the idea that the subjective size of things might not come down to how big they really are, even if your experience is veridical or accurate. And you might wonder if, in my shrink ray thought experiment, what's going on is that, well, things are bound to seem exactly the same because all of the visual angles are just the same. And you might think actually that when you walked out of your room and looked at the street outside, okay, if you've been shrunk, you'd be lower down, but if you get your eyes up to the normal height and that sort of thing, because objects would subtend exactly the same angles from where you're standing, everything would look actually the same as it did prior to being shrunk. But, well, there's more to how big things seem than visual angle. This is a thing called the corridor illusion. The 2 different trees actually on the screen are exactly the same size, but the corridor perspective, if you're able to see the illusion, these things aren't always trustworthy when you put them on the screen, but normally people think that the tree marked A looks small and close up, and the tree marked B looks like a great big tree further away. So there's a difference in the way things look depending on whether they seem to be small and close up or big and far away, even if they subtend the exact same visual angles. Well, we can go off on another little thought experiment here and imagine something a bit like the shrink ray example. Imagine 2 different places, one's called Big Earth and one's called Small Earth, and they are exact duplicates of each other, apart from the fact that on Small Earth, everything is half the size it is on Big Earth. So if we suppose that this is Big Earth that we live on Small Earth there would be a philosoph meeting with people who look just like you and a speaker who looks just like me, but everybody would actually be half the size. And if the intuitions I suggested about shrink ray case are correct, then it ought to be that to the inhabitants of Small Earth, everything looks exactly the same to them, size-wise, as it does to us in our respective environments. But if we took a person from small Earth and brought them here to big Earth and had them stand next to their doppelganger, differing only in size on Earth, looking at the same scene, then what seemed like medium-sized objects not very far away to the bigger person would seem like much bigger objects twice as far away to the smaller person. I'm going to assume that all of that is correct. Seems very pressing to think that it would be correct, because if you think about the, for example, visual experiences of the big and small doppelgangers, well, the pattern of light on the retinas of their eyes is going to be exactly the same. The way their brains are going to be stimulated is going to be exactly the same. I'm assuming that the miniaturized person nevertheless has a brain that perfectly duplicates the larger brain in all its functions. So it seems that everything sort of matches neurologically, and what they would be disposed to say and do all perfectly matches. So I think it's very plausible that phenomenologically it's a match as well. If you're worried by exotic thought experiments like this, of course you don't need to go along with the thought experiments. You can just think about big and small actual creatures in the real world, just as Berkeley did. Think how the world appears to an ant or to a squirrel. So, what all of this seems to suggest so far is that the size-related phenomenal character of your spatial experiences represents things not as having a certain absolute size, but represents something else. Well, what might that be? Well, probably one of the first things that would occur to you is that since what's constant between big Earth and small Earth is the relative sizes of things, that maybe what our size-related experiences represent is not simply the sizes of things, but the sizes of things relative to us, in particular relative to our bodies. After all, if all you have to do to change how big things appear to somebody is make their body bigger or smaller, then it would seem to follow that, at least insofar as their experiences are correctly representing the way things are, the only obvious candidate for what could be correctly represented is this relative size. And I think that that's correct. I used to think it was incorrect. I wrote a paper on spatial experience in 2011 where I argued against this. And I argued against it because of an objection that I'm about to tell you about. But I now think that there's a good reply to that objection, and that interesting things follow. There are, in fact, two rather troubling objections to this body-relative view of phenomenological size. The first one I'll call the problem of overall scale. So, you look around you and things seem a certain size and a certain distance away from you. And if you look at your own body, it seems a certain size, it looks a certain size, and if you feel it, if you sort of wiggle your toes and touch the top of your head, the top of your head feels a certain distance from your toes. So things overall seem to have a certain size. But then why do things seem to be that size and not some other size? If each perceived object could be perceived as phenomenologically bigger or smaller, why not all of them be perceived collectively as bigger or smaller, while staying in exactly the same proportions? For example, why is it that the room around you and the people here and your body seem this size rather than seeming sort of expanded by a factor of 2 or shrunk by a factor of 2? If the whole story about the way things seem to us is that objects are perceptually represented as being a certain size relative to our body, then there seems to be no explanation for why things phenomenologically seem this size rather than a different size. That was the reason I rejected this view in previous work, but I think now that was actually a mistake. So, that's the first objection to the body relative view. The second one is what I call the problem of alien physiology. How do things look to creatures that are different shapes? So far I've been telling you about people who are perfect duplicates except that they're different sizes, and suggesting that the difference in size can lead to a difference in how big external things seem. But now there's a horrible complication. Consider these three very simple shaped beings. Obviously you can imagine human beings that are different shapes and run the same sort of furrow. So large and small are square-shaped people, or beings of some kind, it doesn't matter. And the one I'm calling large is twice as big as the one I'm calling small. So far so good. According to the arguments so far, if you put large and small next to each other, then everything will seem twice as big and twice as far away, phenomenologically, to small as to large. But now there's this third character who I'm calling slim. And slim is exactly the same height as large, but exactly the same width as small. So how do things look size-wise to slim? Do they look the same size as they do to large because slim is the same height as large? Do they look the same size to slim as they do to small because slim is the same width as small? It seems obvious there isn't going to be a principled answer to this question. It's certainly not going to be correct to say that since slim is a sort of horizontally shrunk relative to large, that things are going to seem sort of elongated in some way. That doesn't seem at all plausible. Somebody who happens to have a slim body doesn't see circular things as though they were ovals. So this strikes me as a really serious problem for the body relative view as I've described it so far. So do we abandon the view, or is there a way to fix it? Well, I think there's a way to fix it. The way to fix it concerns denying that there is what is sometimes called a categorical phenomenology for size. And this is why I was mistaken when I thought about this previously. I thought there was a categorical phenomenology. Now I've become convinced that there isn't. Partly through reading David Chalmers, who has argued fairly recently against categorical size phenomenology. What it means to say that there is a categorical spatial phenomenology is that there is a particular phenomenal character associated with things seeming a certain specific size. Such that if your experience has that phenomenal character, then the object that you're perceiving, the experience which has that phenomenal character, will thereby seem a certain size. Not a certain size relative to anything, but just a certain size. And this is what drives the problem of overall scale. It's the assumption that there is such a thing as how big everything seems to be. Like your body and all the other things in this room standing in their particular relations, that they seem this big, not twice as big or half as big as that. So the assumption that there is a categorical size phenomenology is there is such a thing as the phenomenal character of things seeming that big. We can also apply this to the experience of orientation, like things seeming to the left or things seeming to the right. It might seem very plausible at first thought that phenomenologically, the phenomenal character of your experience when something seems to be to your left is different from the phenomenal character of your experience when something seems to be to your right. And it might seem that even if you adopt the body relative view with regard to left and right phenomenology, which I think we should, still you've got a certain thing appearing to your left, which is the same size as your left hand, and another thing appearing to your right, which is the same side as your right hand. But there might seem to be, in addition to these facts about how your body relates to things external to your body, some additional fact about which side of your body and the external world you experience as being to the left, phenomenologically, and which one to the right, such that the whole thing could, in principle, have been swapped over. Well, Chalmers argues that's a mistake, and I've come to think that he's right about that. The contrary view Chalmers calls e-relationism. E stands for experience. It's not to be conflated with the same view about the physical world. There's a question about whether it makes sense to talk about absolute size or left-right orientation in the physical world. But here we're just talking about the phenomenal characters of experiences. I'm not going to argue for e-relationism at any length, but I'll just mention one argument briefly given by Jonathan Simon, who is a former PhD student of Chalmers. He published a paper recently arguing for e-relationism, the denial of a categorical left-right phenomenology. Just to remind you again how this goes, because it was a little bit difficult to get your head around at first. The assumption that there is a categorical left-right phenomenology is the assumption that, in addition to the fact that certain objects are experienced as being on the same side as this arm, say, which you can see and feel, and certain other objects are experienced as being on the same side as that arm, where I'm just demonstrating it, that arm. There's an additional fact that this arm and all the things on this side are phenomenologically to the left, and this arm and all the same things on the same side as this arm is phenomenologically to the right. So there's this additional fact about phenomenological left-right orientation. Now, Jonathan Simon asks us to imagine a non-orientable world. The actual world is not currently thought to be like this, but this is something that is geometrically possible. A non-orientable world is a world that would have the same sort of geometry as a Mobius strip, which you might have come across, or there's also a thing called a Klein bottle, which has the same sort of features. The thing about a Mobius strip is that you might have played around with these at school. You cut a strip of paper, you twist it round for half a turn, and you stick them back together. But don't think of this Mobius strip as being like a piece of paper that has surfaces. Think of it as just a two-dimensional space. So things aren't on the surface of the strip, they're just sort of in that plane. It's just a point thickness of things. And then the weird thing about a Mobius strip construed that way is you can go on a journey through space, just continuously moving, and you can get back to your starting point, and when you get back there, you've been left, right, reversed. And it's geometrically possible for there to be a three-dimensional space where you just go on a journey, go on a sort of circuit, get back to your starting point, and you are left, right, reversed compared to when you started. You could leave something at your starting point and then go off on the journey, and when you get back, things won't match up in the way that they did. So now imagine that you go on this journey in non-orientable space, and you're aware of your body. You can tell your left hand from your right hand, and maybe there's some objects that you bring with you. And we assume that at the beginning you perceive everything veridically, accurately, as they really are. And you go walking along, and you keep in view the objects that you're carrying with you and your own body. Nothing seems to change, and you get back to your starting point. If your experience was veridical when you started, it seems as though it should be veridical when you finished, since you've just walked around and held things with you. And it doesn't seem very plausible that anything in the phenomenal character of your experience would suddenly change while you're going on this journey. And yet, when you get back to the beginning, everything is left, right, reversed, Your body is left, right, reversed, the objects in front of you are left, right, reversed. But by hypothesis, you're still perceiving everything accurately, and there's no change in your phenomenal character of your experience. This probably isn't a conclusive argument against there being a categorical left-right phenomenology, and Simon doesn't claim that it's absolutely conclusive, but it does seem to push us toward becoming more and more suspicious of the idea that there is some phenomenological fact about things seeming specifically to the left and other things seeming specifically to the right, as opposed to simply being on the same side as this part of my body or the same side as this part of my body. Well, I think what applies to the left-right case applies to size as well. There's just no such thing as how big things seem phenomenologically other than relative to other things. Of course, things appear in relative sizes to each other phenomenologically, including one's body. So this provides a really nice solution to the problem of overall scale, and also, I think, the problem of alien phenomenology. Because both of those objections assumed that there was such a thing as how big things appear to be. With the problem of overall scale, I hope that's fairly clear. The worry was, why does everything seem this big rather than some other size? And the answer is, actually, there's no such thing as the phenomenal character of things appearing this big rather than some other size. There is only the relative sizes. Things appear a certain size relative to one's body appears a certain size relative to everything else. That's all fixed. And there's just no further phenomenological fact to explain. And in the case of the problem of alien physiology, well, one experiences one's body as having a certain shape. The slim character, slim's body feels different to slim than large or smalls feel to them. So one feels one's body as occupying a certain region of space with a certain shape and standing in relations to one's perceived environment, and all of that is accurate, unless one's subject to an illusion of some kind. And that's simply all there is to say. And so then questions don't arise about whether things seem as big or small to slim as to large, or to small, the characters large and small. The difference is entirely the difference in how the bodies feel in terms of their shape and how the different parts of the body stand relative to things in the external world. So, problem solved, but now unfortunately there are another two questions that crop up, and I'd like to suggest something to say about them. What time did I start? A bit before.
Only 5 to, but
Okay. Okay.
We have
I think we're about to shift.
yes.
By the way, I should have said right from the beginning, I'm whizzing through a lot of stuff in order to try to get to talk about the things I want to talk about. So I'm saying some things in a very simplified way. I'm hoping that if things seem puzzling or you have questions, you'll ask me about them. Okay, so two questions arise having got to the point of wanting to defend the body relative view and rejecting the idea of a categorical spatial phenomenology. Everything's relations. Question one, well, if there's no categorical size phenomenology, why does there seem to be? That is to say, why is it so tempting, at least to me, to think that there is such a thing as simply how big everything, including one's body, seems? It certainly is just objectively a fact that a lot of philosophers who've written about this topic have just presupposed that there's a categorical size phenomenology. I'd be interested to hear. I suspect that different people would have a different reaction to this. I suspect that some people will find it less tempting than others to think that there's a categorical phenomenology. But certainly I found it quite compelling at first. So why are people making this mistake? That's one question. And then another question is, why is apparent body body size fixed in the way that it seems to be. And what I mean by that is something like this. I suggested that if you were shrunk and then you looked at ordinary sized objects, those people walking by in the street would seem like giants to you, and the road would seem enormously wide. Why does it seem like that? And your body presumably then would seem normal sized. It wouldn't seem to have changed its size. Why does it seem like that rather than, for example, the other way around? Why don't the people in the street seem just ordinary sized and you, your body, feel much smaller? It seems very natural to suppose that it would be this way, that the body would seem the same size and everything else would seem to have changed. But if the whole story about spatial experience is just that objects are experienced as being a certain size relative to your body, then either of these descriptions of what happened seem equally good. And this isn't just philosopher's fantasy here, there is some empirical evidence that we really do experience things this way. Because of a thing called the Barbie doll illusion. What was done in this experiment by Harrison and colleagues was they got somebody to lie down wearing virtual reality goggles. And the virtual reality goggles were projecting the image from a pair of cameras positioned as the eyes of a doll, a small body lying on a bed. And so the person was seeing, as it were, the viewpoint of the doll. They did two versions of this. One was with a small doll, the other one was with a great big oversized giant body. And what they did was they induced a feeling of ownership of the seen body. There's an established way of doing this. What you do is, unbeknown to the person who's the subject in the experiment, you show them through the goggles somebody touching, say, the leg of the doll, and at the exact same moment there's an experimenter touching the leg of the person who's the subject in the experiment. And people immediately experience a very strong sense that the seen body is their body. It sort of overlaps perfectly with their body. There's another thing called the rubber hand illusion, some of you might have come across this like this. And what they found was that subjects in these experiments, where the doll body was the small Barbie-sized doll, the subjects reported that their body felt normal sized, looked normal sized, but everything else in the room seemed enormous. Ordinary human beings walking around appeared like giants a long way away. And in the other version of the experiment, where the doll was a giant doll, they experienced the opposite effect. Their body, the perceived body, still looked like their normal sized body, but everybody else seemed to have shrunk. Everybody seemed tiny and close up. So there's some pretty good evidence that there is some sense in which one's experienced body acts as a sort of anchor for how big everything else seems to be. How can that be true without what's happening being that the phenomenal character of one's bodily spatial experience is fixed, and then everything else is sort of relative to that? Well, I think the answer to both of these questions relates to the same thing, which is the egocentricity of spatial experience. What I mean by the egocentricity, and this is not just me now, lots of people have talked about this. What I mean by the egocentricity of spatial experience is that we experience the world from a certain point of view, and we experience a lot of things that are actually relations between us and other things, as though they were just monadic, as though they were just properties of things, and just those things. This goes together with the fact, and this is something that I've been emphasising in some of my work, it goes together with the epistemological fact that in order to judge certain spatial relations between oneself and other things, one can take a kind of epistemological shortcut. For example, in judging how far away that camera is from where I am. If you want to judge how far I am from that camera, you need to pay attention both to me and to the camera and to judge the distance between those two locations. But I can just look at the camera, and it seems a certain distance away. I don't have to look at my own body and sort of see where that is and compare the two locations. I just need one parameter, one bit of information, just how far away it is. Whereas to make the same judgment about my distance from that camera, you would need two bits of information, my location and the camera's information. Another way to think of this is you could take a camera with a manually focusable lens and just focus it on the object and then read off the distance away from that object. You just need this one number. So sometimes when one stands in a relation to something, one can take advantage of the fact that one is oneself one of the relata in the relation to learn about that relation in a way that's not available to anyone else. One is sort of implicitly there in it, but only implicitly. I call this phenomenon first-person redundancy because having a visual representation of oneself would just be redundant in judging how far away something was, or how big it was, or whether it was to the left or to the right. In judging how big an object is, although I'm claiming that experience represents objects as being a certain size relative to the body, I'm not claiming that I have to look at the object, look at my body, and somehow compare the two. Things appear a certain size without paying attention to one's body in any way, or perceiving one's body. So this is what I mean by egocentricity of spatial experience. Put some symbols there, but you don't need that. So, how does this help? So let's consider the first question. Why does there seem to be a categorical size phenomenology if there isn't? Well, I think the answer lies in the fact that one's own body has this implicit role. One judges how big a thing is, not by comparing it with the size of one's body. One doesn't need to do that. It can still be the case that experience is representing an object as being a certain size relative to the size of one's body, without one having to perceive one's body to make the comparison. And it's that fact that things seem not to have to be experienced as having a size relative to anything. It makes it seem as though things are simply experienced as having a size, even though they are in fact being perceptually represented as having a size relative to the size of one's body. I'll say a bit more about what that amounts to when we get on to the second question. Why is the apparent body size fixed? This was the one relating to the Barbie doll illusion. The question, why is it that if you were shrunk, it wouldn't seem to you as though your body was shrunk, it would seem as though your body was normal size and everything else got bigger. Why is it that way round? Why is the size of one's body a kind of fixed point here? And I think that the answer to that has to do with the fact that one's experience is telling one what one needs in order to correctly judge one's actions with one's body relative to the perceived world. So, some philosophers, going back to, well, actually some early 20th century psychologists, but the phenomenologist Maurice Merleau-Ponty talked about this, a thing called the body schema, which is now a thing that's very much talked about in a certain area of philosophy of mind relating to what's called embodied cognition. And the body schema is supposed to be a kind of representation of the proportions and size and orientation of one's body, including one's limbs, that one's brain uses in order to plan actions. And there's a lot of different views about what exactly the body schema is. Some people think it's not actually an explicit representation of anything at all. It just consists in certain connections between one's perceptual inputs and one's motor outputs. The fact that they are coordinated in such a way that one can act in a harmonious way on one's environment means that it's sort of implicitly built in, that it's sort of implicitly assumed that one's body is a certain shape and size relative to other things. So, if you combine this with the first-person redundancy of perceptual experience, what we get is something like this. That, suppose you're trying to decide whether or not something is at a distance from you where you could reach out and touch it. You could just look at your arm and make a comparison and see whether your arm would reach that, but you don't need to. Your experience simply gives you a sense, because you have this body schema that enables you to sort of plan or imagine motor actions, and you have a sense of what you can and can't do with your body relative to the space that you perceive. And if you were suddenly shrunk, then things would appear twice as far away because, well, suppose that something is 1 unit away when it's just touchable with your arm straight in front of you. So if you were shrunk to half the size, then now something would be twice as far away as you could reach with your arm, so now it's 2 units away. So you could just scale things by those sorts of units, as it were. I'm not suggesting there are actual units here, but you know, the size is what it needs to be represented as being in order for you to judge what you can or can't do with your body relative to that thing. So it's the implicit and action-oriented nature of the body schema that I think is driving all of this. It's driving the fact that one's body is sort of felt as a constant, because after all, if you were shrunk, the significance of your body for your actions wouldn't change. The significance of everything else for your body actions would change, but the significance of your body for your body actions would be constant. So it's these two things, I think, the first-person redundancy and the nature of the body schema, which I think are closely related to each other, that I think are driving this feeling that there is a categorical size phenomenology, even though I think there isn't. So in the abstract, I promised a hint about the mind-body problem. This is going to be a really fast hint. This is the last slide. I do think that if all conscious experiences are egocentric in the way that I've described, if they're all our first-person redundant, if all of our experiences are really telling us about relations between ourselves and other things, which is a view that won't be obvious, but I think it can be defended, then, well, there's this big problem about the mind-body problem, which is the problem of what the relation is between mind and the physical world. Some of you will have come across arguments like the knowledge argument or the zombie argument, which all trade on the thought that no matter how much you know about the physical world, it's not going to tell you about conscious experiences. And what I think is going on here is that a physical description of the world is from a third-person point of view. It's the sort of description anyone can have access to. But our conscious experiences are egocentric representations of our own relations to our environment. Other people can know about our relations to our environment, but only we can know about it in that particular way. Only we have the kind of epistemic access to it that enables us to leave ourselves implicit in it and just judge how far away things are, or whether they're to the left or the right, without comparing with our own bodies. And I think that there are good reasons to think that you can't get from the third-person point of view ultimately is the key to explaining away these arguments like the knowledge argument, conceivability argument, that seek to undermine a materialist view of mind. Okay, went over a little bit, but that's it.
Thank you so much. So now we'll move on to Q&A. So if you have any questions for Dr. Foster, now is the time to ask. And for those on the Teams meeting, you can either unmute yourself and hopefully we will somehow hear you, or you can feel free to type your question in the chat and I'll have a look in a couple minutes and we'll go over those. Any further questions? Stefan?
Hi, so thank you for the talk. Just to clarify on the last point, basically the first person redundancy and the body schemata, does that somehow imply that there's like an inaccessible first person perspective that can explain the gap between like...
Yeah,
okay.
basically.
So then my question would be, what it seemed to me is that the body schemata may be closely related to like proprioception. So essentially the neurons governing that we know the position of our limbs and our body. So technically, if that is what the body schemata is, then that would mean that you can explain this first person perspective from a third person, because if you knew the activity of all these proprioceptive neurons, then you could explain the first person perspective.
So what I think is, yes, you can explain the first person perspective. In fact, it's kind of what I'm doing. But it's one thing to be aware that there is a first person perspective. It's another thing to be able to take that perspective. So the thought is that if you have some creature, maybe that's physiologically some way different from a human being, but you think it has conscious experiences and you wonder what it would be like to be that sort of creature, you can learn all the physical facts. You can even learn that this creature has a certain kind of egocentric perspective on its environment and even on its body. But unless you can actually reproduce that perspective in yourself, you can't see it from their point of view, so to speak, or almost literally. And so that's what you would need in order to understand what the phenomenology would be for that creature. And that's what you can't do.
So essentially this is like a different version of like the Mary experiment, but you just replace the like retina for like motor neurons.
Well, you can do you can run the Mary experiment with absolutely anything. You know, if Mary, I don't know how this would work with space, but if somehow or other she had never had any kind of spatial experience, if that were possible, it's a tough one actually to figure that out. But you can imagine the first time she had those experiences that she would learn something. And what I'm doing here is, whereas the knowledge argument seeks to take this gap in knowledge to deduce that there's a metaphysical gap and some kind of dualism is true, I'm trying to explain away that gap in a way that's compatible with materialism.
Okay, I have a bit of a question. I'm not sure if I understood well, but once we started talking about the body schema and how you were saying that you can reach out, without reaching out, you get a sense of whether you can reach something. It seems like the way one moves in space also might have an effect on how big or small or far away things seem. So I was thinking of like a bee and a beetle, right? The beetle is kind of low on the ground, and if both the bee and the beetle are sitting on a flower, the flower seems to be a certain size, but the bee has a sense of flying around and moving very quickly and seeing how vast the world is, whereas the beetle might be in a certain confined space and things actually don't seem far away and don't seem... I don't know what that says about any of this. Does it play into...
This is actually roughly what I used to think.
Oh, right. Okay.
I used to think, so that view and the view that I currently hold both have one thing in common, which is that what the phenomenology is giving you is the functional role of your environment relative to you. So the current name for my overall view, I'm calling it external world functionalism. It's the view that two creatures having experiences alike in phenomenal character that are veridical, their experiences are therefore representing their environments as functionally identical relative to them. Their environments could be intrinsically quite different, but functionally relative to them, it would be the same. So the body relative view counts as a version of that view because the shape and size of your body is going to determine all sorts of things about how you can interact with your environment. So it's a particular case of that. The kind of view you suggest, I did think about sort of movement around through space and the sort of effort required to move around. And I think Berkeley played around with a view a little bit like that. Berkeley thought that experienced distance was reducible to things like how much walking you would have to do to get there and that kind of thing. But I felt that the problem of alien physiology then becomes really difficult to solve. If you want to compare you and an octopus, how is the world going to appear spatially to an octopus relative to you? It's going to be really difficult to answer that question given that kind of view, unless you just reduce it purely to ability to move around. But then, I think once you think about the examples a bit more, I think the body relative view starts to become a bit more plausible. I do think that a view like this applies to time as well as to space, by the way. The rate at which things happen, how long things take. I think that's all in a certain sense relative to one's mental processes and things one can do with one's body.
Thank you. Any other questions? Andrew?
I guess this is gonna be very a stupid question because
There
I'm
are no
quite
stupid questions.
new to this. But as a painter myself, I just want to ask what's your take on paintings, because as artists you create illusion of size, but you start out with a understanding and the mathematical understanding of foreshortenings. So when all of us are the same size when we walk into the museum, when we look at paintings with different foreshortening created illusions. So we might look at painting, for example, The Starry Night, where Monet's water lilies have a very different take on how big the size of the lily are. But then they're mathematically defined and it is very carefully painted to create that illusions, but we are still the same size. So what's that? Just my question.
Interesting question. So let me think. What would happen if our miniaturized people looked at artworks? Would they appear exactly the same because the painting creates a certain sort of view? It sort of perhaps simulates a visual experience where in order for the miniature people, things would have to be a different size and distance than they were for the bigger people looking at that painting. I'm not quite sure. It's a very complicated thing because our brains pick up on all sorts of different things to judge how big and far away the world actually is from us. And I'm talking about how we come to have experience that is accurate. Of course, there are all kinds of ways that we can be fooled. So for example, one thing we do is we judge from our movements. You move just slightly from side to side and things become occluded to different degrees. And that's a major clue. Our brains also look for things like textures and texture gradients and make assumptions about how big things are based on how they normally look. So from where I'm standing, there's a whole lot of chairs, and I'm used to seeing chairs, and my brain sort of implicitly assumes that chairs are a certain size, and so tries to make things seem that big. And you can create weird illusions by manipulating that kind of thing. So presumably one thing that's going on in a painting is a lot of those sorts of texture gradients and those sorts of things are all being used to create the feeling of a certain sort of size and distance.
I guess, yeah, the reason why I asked the question, because you always you describe things as, oh, I'm gonna enlarge myself, but actually you can also describe it as I'm gonna miniaturize everything around me, so that I think painting is that kind of, it's like I holding myself fixed, but I'm making everything else smaller or everything else bigger.
Do you, well,
Yeah, that's what I'm, yeah.
are you now thinking about the physical size of the painting itself?
No, as in like you're trying to, as in like you're making everything else that you painted feel like smaller, in the sense is like you're, I can't really like describe, I'm sorry, but like, so as a painter, you're trying to create the illusion that everything is smaller, even though they're bigger than you in some sense. Anyway, I think that's a very tangential point.
Yeah, I'm not an expert on the perception of paintings. I'm on photography, so I should know more about this. But,
yeah, it's okay.
I always assumed that paintings and visual art generally are, to some degree, trying to sort of trigger our brains to treat it as a visual experience, to sort of simulate a visual experience that we could actually have. And then, of course, something that's actually small on the canvas might seem like a large object far away, and so on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Nigel.
This may also be a bit of a silly question, but so if there's a creature that had no sense of time, so I would think that that would imply no sense of memory. How would that work into perceiving spatial reasoning and spatial capacity?
So, can you say a little bit more? What is this creature? Is this simply a creature with no memory at all?
It would be, I think, my initial thought was just the time, but then I would just think that that would assume no memory, right? Because if there is no sense of time, then you're living in like the absolute phenomenological first person. Like there's nothing other than what's right in front of you. But then would spatial reasoning then almost be devoid because everything is new every second that you're moving through it?
Well, here's what I will say. I find it difficult to imagine a creature like this because it's not clear that a creature that has literally no memory can actually have any coherent experience at all.
Yeah.
But certainly, it seems to me quite plausible that our understanding of space and our experience of space is very connected up with our ability to act in space.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very sort of pragmatic representation of space. And of course, actions take time.
Mm-hmm.
So if a certain thing seems like it's at a distance that I could walk to in a certain amount of time,
Mm-hmm.
that requires me to be able to represent time and imagine myself moving to a different time.
Mm-hmm.
So if I had no conception of other times at all, if I didn't grasp that there is a time series, if I just have a sort of snapshot of the world and no understanding that things can happen in that world, that might have weird effects on one's understanding of space as well, I would have thought.
Yeah, I would think it would like undermine the whole like phenomenology of like spatial reasoning, right?
It's quite possible. I mean, it's, as I say, it's a slightly dangerous game speculating about what happens if you just sort of take away one part of experience and assume that the rest could remain the same.
Yeah.
But if we just assume for the moment that there is such a possibility that somebody has just a snapshot conception of space with no conception of things happening in space or moving around in space, I would have thought that would have severely constrained one's understanding of what space is, what it even means to say that something is a certain distance away.
Yeah.
I mean, this would probably work in physics as much as in psychology, that it's not clear that you can give much meaning to the notion of physical distance without there being physical processes, things traveling through space and so on.
Yeah, definitely.
I understood that you started off studying physics and then...
I did originally, yeah, I did a first
philosophy.
degree.
In fact.
Any last questions? Maybe we can end doing a show of hands. You asked that you said half the room might think.
Categorical phenomenology, yeah, I'm interested to know whether you were all thinking that, yeah, of course it's all just relative to oneself, or whether it seemed, when I was talking about the problem of overall scale, whether it does seem as though everything, including one's
Okay, show of hands. I don't know how to formulate the question, but
Well, so the one that I certainly found plausible before I started thinking about this was that there's a categorical spatial phenomenology. So that's the idea that things just seem a certain size, including one's body, even once you've fixed all the ratios. And also that there's such a thing as things seeming to the left or to the right, and not just seeming the same side as this part of my body. So put your hand up if you naturally would think prior to this talk that there is categorical spatial phenomenology. Okay, yeah, that's a sort of 60%, something like that, I think. It's about what I would have guessed.
just change their mind.
If you're at least undecided as a result of the talk, then that's good.
Okay, great. Thank you so much again for coming and doing the talk with us.
Thank you all very much.